Hello and welcome to another episode of Spiritually Incorrect, a special second part episode. I'm your host, Seth Hart. Join with me is Jonathan Lionhart.
Namaste, my new age friend.
Oh, goodness. Is that like some other language for howdy?
I'm just that sophisticated and enlightened,
It's
so I
from
can
eating
go.
at that Indian buffet so much. You picked up a few things.
Yes, yes. I've reached the higher heavens, and I'm sort of bodhisattvaing you by coming back to try to return you up with me.
Nobody knows what a bodhisattva is.
I know I've left the lower levels of existence and danced with angels in the higher realms, but now I've descended back down, sort of like Christ's incarnation, to
Also,
have this conversation with you to try to save you, Seth.
you know who else danced with angels and then descended? Satan.
Yes, but he wasn't as
Coin
good at
flip which
dancing.
one you are.
He wasn't as good as dancing at me as me. Like
But he could,
I'm yeah.
but he could sure play a fiddle.
Well, what is today? What is so the last episode you gave a really sophisticated, comprehensive summary outline of New Age thought, where it came from, theosophy, all of these different traditions. And I guess in this episode, we're actually going to debate some of the ideas, like
Yeah,
how New Age can Christians be? What things can we get on board with? What can't we get on board with?
nice
Let's
pivot away from our forced conversation, our forced little intro. Yeah, we're going to talk about New Age and the application of it. What can we do with it? Well, I say New Age, and I mean the New Age, the remix, the spiritual but not religious, this revival of these beliefs. So, I mean, there's a ton that we could talk about. We talked about theosophy, spiritualism, New Thought. We talked about three contemporary streams of that I labeled the intellectual tradition, the mystical tradition, and the magic tradition. With magic sometimes spelled with a K. That's the Aleister Crowley stuff. So, John, what do you think? First off, what are your reactions to all of that? I know that was a sort of drinking from the fire hydrant moment.
Yeah, it was a lot. It's interesting that some Christians, especially in the anthroposophy uh kind of stream are
Anthroposophy.
okay. uh it's interesting that Christians were involved in these streams, that they didn't always see them as inconsistent with the Christian worldview, but that there were overlaps there. I mean, what were some of the overlaps that they were seeing, Seth?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that Rudolf Steiner really emphasized was the centrality of Christ as a sort of pivot figure, as a sort of unique expression of spirituality in some sense. His ideas are not necessarily Orthodox Christianity, but the very idea of putting Christ at the center as Christ is something unique was what allowed a lot of Christians to say, maybe there's something here, especially like
Mm.
Owen Barfield, right? And with Steiner actually separated off from the Theosophists because he felt like they denigrated Christ, which is
Hmm.
real interesting. He thought that they were so focused on Eastern wisdom and stuff that they missed what the Western tradition had to offer. So that's why anthroposophy is much more intellectual, like Westerners, like Western religions in general are more intellectual. It's a very general statement. That's not universally true, but generally it was that Jesus was unique. He sort of has holds a center point in Rudolf Steiner's views. And because of that, people like Owen Barfield, like this early sort of Christian adopter of anthroposophy, linking into the Inklings, who, that's how it sort of filtered into that. Well, in Barfield's thought, that consciousness, in some sense, you can map that out through history. There's actually a recent book that tries to update that view called The Secret History of Christianity. Go check it out. It's an interesting book. I'm not saying you'll agree with everything in it, but it's still interesting if you're curious about Barfield's views. And basically, it's this idea that consciousness moves in waves, that consciousness itself is evolving over time. We can actually map this out scientifically through what we see in art, through what we see in cognitive science, scientific studies. And Jesus, in some sense, was a pivot point that sort of like if there was a fall, Jesus was a pivot backward to where consciousness, in some sense, moves back up the chain. I can get more specific than that, but that's generally where this idea came from. Is Christ central in some way? In some sense, is he bringing the divine to humanity? And anthroposophists were much more comfortable with saying that. And it goes all the way back to Steiner himself.
Would they say that Jesus is unique in that he does something that only he, as God and man, could do? Or would they say he's unique in that he was the first to do something that then others can come and do as well.
Depends on the anthroposophists, right? Because there is different branches of that tradition. Some very Christianized, some not so much.
Yeah, because I think a lot of New Age stuff really does bring Christ into things. Christ consciousness, Christ
Yeah,
as a bodhisattva. Like there is a lot of Christ in these texts. Just like the Quran talks about Jesus a lot, but that doesn't mean it's the same Jesus,
no, and
right?
with Christ consciousness, I've got to be very careful when I say that we need to be very careful when we talk about Christ consciousness. This is something you'll hear quite frequently. In fact, one of my students recently came up and was like, "Do you know what this is?" And we hear Christ consciousness, and maybe our automatic reaction is, "Oh, it's the consciousness of Christ." But a lot of times, what that actually comes from is this Gnostic belief that Christ is in some sense a separate idea or principle from Jesus, and Jesus became the Christ.
Oh,
And what they do is they basically say that Christ, in some sense, reached a place that Jesus, in some sense, reached a place where he was able to take on Christ consciousness. Like he evolved spiritually enough that he recognized his own inner divinity. So Christ is divine, but no special way. He just recognized his divinity.
we too
Yes,
are divine,
you
and if we can rise to that level, I can get
you
Christ
can become, yeah,
consciousness.
you can get Christ consciousness. That's even filtered into contemporary spiritual writers who a lot of Christians read, like Richard Rohr. His book, The Universal Christ, talks about how Christ's claim, Jesus' claim of being the Christ, isn't anything unique. You too can become Christ.
Yeah. Well, how would we distinguish this? Because, I mean, once you start getting into the nuances of it, how might we distinguish this from something like theosis or deification in, say, like Eastern Orthodoxy? Because I don't think they would
Yeah.
say that, but how would we make that line very clear?
Yeah, there's a huge difference from theosis in the Eastern tradition. Now, if you know anything about Eastern Orthodox, you'll know that they have this idea called sometimes called theosis, sometimes called deification or divinization. And we as Western Protestants or Catholics sometimes get uncomfortable with that
Yeah.
language. We want to draw a very sharp distinction between who God is and who we are. But if you actually look into that, what they do is they take very seriously what Peter says when he says that we will partake of the divine nature. And to partake of the divine nature, in some sense, means that you are divinized in some sense. There was no way of reading that passage in the first century and not realizing that, in some sense, to partake of the divine nature is, in some sense, to be divine. This is why
Hmm.
we're called sons of God. It's not just a nice, friendly language or talking about God's love for us. A son was thought to inherit the nature of his father. In Greco Roman culture, the son took on the nature of his father. So when we are called sons of God, it's saying we are inheriting, in some sense, divine qualities. So that's just part of Orthodox Christian teaching. It's something we don't like to
Yeah.
prioritize, and yet it's still there. It's absolutely there.
Yeah, so my son participates in some sense in me and what I am and inherits much of what I am. And yet, the Eastern Orthodox Christian would still very emphatically say, I am not my son. We're
Yeah,
different. There's a distinction there. Whereas, and that distinction can be there in some of the New Age stuff, but in a lot of the works, it's not.
no, because what the Eastern Orthodox would never say is they would never say you become God.
Yeah.
That there is still an eternal, infinite distinction between you and the divine nature. In fact, they quite often prioritize that even stronger than the Westerners do. They have things called the essence energies distinction, which very staunchly resists any idea of creatures ever becoming the creator.
Well, and precisely because they are getting closer to that divinized thing, they need to really emphasize where the limits of that are in a
Yeah,
way that, because we don't even verge on it, we don't have to emphasize the limits quite as much.
yeah.
Um,
What they would want to say is that humanity was made to partake of God. That in some sense, our trajectory, if you look at our goal, our orientation, our telos,
Mhm.
if you want to get into the Greek, is God. Whereas what Easterners will say is that we are primordially God. And when I say Easterners, I mean people in the West who've adopted Eastern philosophies. Not all Easterners say this, but in some sense, at the very origin of all things, there was only God. And that everything in the universe, in some sense, is merely a manifestation, a finite manifestation of something divine. The divine, in some sense, broke itself up in order to know itself. Quite often, you'll see this in the spiritual but not religious. This idea of that the one became two, became three, which is a statement they'll take from Taoist philosophy. This breaking up of the divine without, in some sense, losing the divinity, but in some sense, adding multiplicity to the divine unity. In some sense,
So nothing exists except for God. Yeah, like
in
all
one
that
sense,
is
yes.
God. There,
Yes.
you might genuinely encounter other things, but those things are an illusion of the body or of the temporary mindset. Once you kind of peel back the illusion, you realize all things are God, and
Yeah.
I am that. And
There definitely is a superficial similarity to some Christian teachings, especially Eastern Orthodox. But once you really get into that, you recognize there's a huge difference.
so that can lead a lot of people to be like, oh, this book is talking about Jesus. These guys are talking about Jesus. Like, oh, this is Christian as well. But it's not Jesus as the one who's in the Trinity in a way that's unique. It's you too can do what Jesus did. Jesus might have been unique in being the first one or one of the most important people to do this, but you too can rise up and realize that you already are God. The Godhead is you, and you are the Godhead.
And
And
how
Jesus is just the first one to walk the path, but now that he's walked it, you can follow behind him.
Yeah, in some sense, what's called moral exemplar plays strong in their theology. The idea that Jesus was not different in any way except in degree from us. There's no difference in kind. The divinity within Jesus is merely a greater understanding of the divine that's already present within us. And normally, how that's phrased is through the statement, I am. What you'll encounter quite a bit in the spiritual but not religious or self help readings is the idea that God's personal name in the Hebrew Bible is I am. That's what he revealed to Moses. I am. And that, of course, then leads to the idea of what does that mean, if not that in some sense God just is subjectivity itself. God just is I am. But here's the thing. I can say I am. You can say I am.
We are
So
too.
yeah, exactly. And even though everything about me is changing, I'm very different from what I was 10 years ago and will be very different from what I am now in 10 years. My I-ness will persist. That's the one permanent thing about me that somehow transcends all the physical changes. So maybe God's I am is my I am and your I am. That in some sense, that I-ness that we all share is the divine within us. And to
What is
rediscover
truly
that,
yeah.
yeah, to rediscover that, to sort of inwardly dive and recognize your own subjectivity, away from all the changing ephemeral things of the world, is to recognize the divine, that you are truly divine.
Yeah, I'm not my personality, because my personality has changed in the last 10 years, the last 20 years. Like, me today is drastically different personality-wise from me when I met Seth for the first time, which is why we became friends, because we'd never be friends now. But 20 years ago when we first met, it seemed like we might be a
It's
good
sort
fit.
of just like relational inertia that keeps us going. We just have
Yeah.
to. We're friends now, so I guess we just
We're
got to
stuck.
keep
Well, I
being
married
friends.
your sister. I married your sister. I'm stuck now. But so like my personality
No wonder
can't be...
God dissolved marriages after the resurrection. No wonder marriages are dissolved.
So you can
Freedom.
be relieved. Yeah.
Freedom.
So my personality can't be what I truly am, because that changes. The I, the soul, the self must be deeper than personality, hobbies, those types of things, because those things change. It has to be deeper than the body as well, because your body changes. You grow bigger and bigger, then it withers and fades, and then you eventually die. So the I am about you can't be bodily, it can't be your personality. And the more and more you chisel away those things, the less there's anything that distinguishes you from anyone else. And in turn, the less there's anything that distinguishes me from God. Because if you get rid of my personality, you get rid of my individuality, you get rid of my body, and I'm just sort of a disembodied soul, how different is that from the divine soul? And the more you shed these superficial things in the thought, the less there is that separates you from God or from anyone else. And then you realize there is no differences, there's no otherness, there's no self and other, there's just the one divine soul that is all of us. But of course, as we've nuanced that the Eastern Orthodoxy doesn't say this, let's also nuance that not all New Age thought says this. it's only some aspects of New Age thought that emphasize
Well,
this because
we
they
mean remixed. New Age thought does say this, right? Remember, that's like one idea. Like the New Age is
yeah.
dead,
But I'm saying there's nuanced aspects here, and
right? The spiritual but not religious don't all say this. Yeah.
yes,
Sorry, I
and
just wanted to
yeah,
clarify.
no, that's fine. And this is one of the things that people often say. Eastern thought, like Chinese and Indian thought, says this about like the self divine, but that's difficult because so much of what we think of Eastern, Chinese, Indian thought is mediated through the last century of what was imported to the West. And what was imported to the West was primarily this view called Advaita Vedanta, which says that we are God, that God is one with all of us. And so we have this kind of view of the East and Eastern worldviews that are very filtered through that perception.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing because there's other aspects of the Eastern traditions that simply aren't like that at all. So, for instance, Dvaita Vedanta has a very sharp division between God and the world, and it does not mix those up. You're never going to become divine. You're never going to become Vishnu. And that is a perfectly legitimate tradition within the Hindu religion. It's completely different from what we mostly think about of as Eastern religions. It actually more closely resembles a lot of the Western monotheistic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, than it does even other branches of Hinduism, to be completely honest.
So when we say that the sort of Western spiritual crowd has imported Eastern thought, we're saying they've
It's
imported very specific strands of Eastern thought, and those tend to have been the ones that break down the creator creature distinction and make us God.
it's because those were the ones that were most unique, the most foreign, the most attractive in that
The most
sense.
exotic. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And there's a few people you can pin this on, guys like Vivekananda, who was an early, in some sense, missionary of Hinduism to the West and was quite successful, but he basically sold Hinduism as Advaita Vedanta, which is why most textbooks, even today, will treat Hinduism as if that is what it is, even though it's only one small strand within the much broader tradition.
Mhm.
So
Well,
everything you know about Hinduism is often wrong, guys.
cool.
So kind of going in a different direction from that, we've obviously clarified where we think the idea of where Christians think the idea of divinization is very, very different from the idea of the spiritual but not religious, with some of the ideas adopted from there. I'm going to switch it around and say there's some ideas I think we can adopt
Okay.
very
Let's
explicitly.
summon the dead. Let's do it, Seth. You and me.
Absolutely. No, we already had a whole episode on
We
like
did.
why
Go
not to
back
do
and
it.
listen to that one. Yeah.
Always got to self promote. No, one of the things we haven't talked about,
Me.
huh?
I'm self-promoting.
Oh, gotcha. One of the things what we haven't really talked about, I remember I brought up like why India became this sort of hotspot way back in the 1800s.
Okay. Yeah, you were talking about the British Empire and yeah.
Right. And that spirituality had become quite dry in that period. Well, one of the things that Protestantism really exaggerated was this death of the enchanted cosmos. That God is in heaven, we are on earth, and the universe itself kind of became evacuated of anything spiritual or mystical. Protestantism really de-emphasized that, and we began to have a sort of natural clockwork universe that in essence was kind of dead.
It
We
was
as
not
life form,
spiritual
yeah,
or
it was not.
soulish.
Yeah,
It's
there was
just
no depth to reality, the world around us.
the world is just dead matter and mechanistic machine atoms bouncing off each other in a void.
Essentially, yeah, this atomistic sort of just universe is just a sort of clockwork universe that created God. God's sort of out there, and it was a very dry sort of spirituality. It's a very dry way of viewing the world. That's actually quite alien, I think, to how we actually perceive the world. And to me, the answer that people looked for was in the East, rather than within the Christian tradition itself, which quite often had a more enchanted view of the cosmos. You go back to the Middle Ages and into early Christianity, the universe was just filled with spirits and depth and meaning. In fact, the entire universe was quite often seen as communicating something about the divine presence, even if it wasn't itself divine. And what I think people were looking for in the Eastern tradition was something that they had lost within their own Western tradition.
So, in emphasizing the creator creature distinction, that the creator is distinct from the creature, that we're not God, it kind of meant that all of the holy, spiritual, beautiful things were up there in heaven with God, and we were split off from that. So, God was too distant, too other, too transcendent. There was this chasm between us and God, and so down here began to look dead, lifeless, and unspiritual because
Very
all
rational, scientific, dead universe where spirits and demons began to be doubted and angels. The
God
world
isn't
was just
close. He's not
evacuated of,
operating in here.
yeah,
Yeah.
God's transcendence kind of overwhelmed his immanence, that the immanence of God, the immanence of the spiritual within the world and all aspects around us, this more that we grasp when we see a beautiful landscape or, feel like connectedness to nature.
Yeah.
Christianity didn't have a language for that anymore.
Which is sad because Christianity almost seems primed for that language with the incarnation, with the goodness of creation. When God creates it, he calls it good, all of these things.
And I tend to think that Catholic countries, you don't really see as many remixed in those countries. You don't see as many spiritual but not religious in Catholic countries because the Catholics do have a language for this that they've preserved, especially through their emphasis on the sacrament, where the material aspects of this, there's more to it. There's a sort of hidden realm to that, and that's a centerpiece of their
Like
worship.
when we drink the blood, the wine, and we eat the bread, something spiritual actually happens in that material interaction. It's not just a symbol or a nice gesture. Something metaphysical is actually happening in the physical world. God is present, close, and near. This is a different view.
More to it. This
of
is
reality.
This points beyond itself. I gave this illustration quite recently to the students, which is I put up the word Gott, Gott, and I said, "What is that? Anyone know?" And there's a lot of people. Nobody knew what it is. And I said, "Well, that's actually the German word for God." And there's like, I see it now. It's close.
Mein Gott, I should have guessed this.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, wohl. The people see it when they see the word Gott. They initially don't know what it is unless they know German. But once I tell them what it is, they see it and they can't really unsee it. Before I told them that, though, they could have been really great scientists. They could have told me every fact about that word, the letters, the curvature, the color. They could have given me every fact. And to me, that's what science does. In a purely scientific worldview, which during the Industrial Revolution was becoming more and more prominent, could do the exact same thing. But the most important thing was the one thing that was missing, which is the meaning of that word, which is that it points to God. And whereas I think you see in medieval Christianity, you see how all of creation, in some sense, were words of God, spoken out by God. Every single thing of creation.
Not see it.
Yeah, they could not see it. They knew the language. Whereas today, we've sort of forgotten the language. We've become scientists who don't know the language, who can tell you everything about it, but can't tell you the meaning.
And where is this God you're talking about? He's not in the G. He's not in the O. We've dug deep into the T's. He's not in any of the T's. Where is this God you're talking about?
Right.
And yet, but once you have a sense, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere. It's not in a specific spot. It's the whole thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I do think that is the idea of creation that's communicated. What's really funny is there are very few Christian apologists right now engaging in the spiritual but not religious, despite its prominence. That's sad. But what makes this even sadder is a lot of them push back on this exact point. The very thing I think that makes it so popular, which is that it has an enchanted view of the cosmos. They say, no, Christianity can't have an enchanted view of the cosmos.
That breaks down the creator-creature distinction.
Yes, they have no nuance. Yeah, which would render heretics most of Christians in history.
Yeah.
Except them, of course. And so, you have a book, I believe a recent one was by Michael Horton, where I think it's called The Shaman and the Sage, which attempts to sort of give a genealogy, a sort of origin of the spiritual but not religious, and tracing it back to pre-Christian Greek culture and stuff. For all its intents and purposes, its theological impetus, which is to show that Christians have always done battle against the enchanted cosmos and blah, 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 is a very Calvinistic reading of history. Calvinists very much stress the transcendence of God to the expense of God's immanence and how God is revealed in creation, which is something I don't think Calvin himself did. But it is something more modern versions of Calvinism very staunchly defend. And you see that, and I think that just makes the problem worse.
Hmm. Well,
That
and it's interesting. Go ahead.
that in order to be a Christian, you have to deny something fundamental about how you encounter the world.
So we're coming off a little too reactionary then. We're trying not to be this stereotype of Eastern and New Age and spiritual but not religious, and then we're going too far the other way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how we often react to opposing viewpoints, right? We take the most reactionary position that we can. If they believe this, we need to believe the opposite, lest we, in some sense, compromise the faith. Little realizing that in doing so, is actually how we mostly compromise the faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think we need, if the answer to the spiritual but not religious is to recapture that sense of the enchanted cosmos that was so prominent in the Middle Ages and the early church, and
Yeah.
just to be able to emphasize that again, I think you're going to see people less attracted to these other forms of spirituality the more they recognize that this is already found in my home church.
And there's I can kind of think of there being two ways that this works out. There's the one which is nature, is there something spiritual about the natural and en masse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and you can see that in the sacraments and those types of things. And there's some of that in the Romantic movement in the West, but the Romantic movement's so driven by Spinoza that some of the more nuanced Christian romantics don't prevail in the popular narrative. And so romanticism kind of gets Christians try to distance themselves from that as well. This idea
Not
that
all, but yeah,
that's what I'm not saying all, but on a popular level, it tends to get portrayed that way. And so
sure,
once again, in order to not be Spinoza and these romantic guys, we got to go the other direction, even though it
sure,
was more nuanced than that.
yeah,
Um, and so, yeah, there's this sense of is nature, are heaven and earth closer than we think? Uh, in a big picture sense, is nature somewhere where you can encounter God? But
yeah,
there's also the nitpicky details, like, are there fairies in nature? And
sure,
and are demons and angels running around? And this is, bringing in the Catholic side of things. They're still talking about exorcists. Protestants have exorcists, but it's just not anywhere near the level to
right.
which Catholics have exorcists, because there's still this sense that not just that the material and the spiritual are hovering over each other very close, but that the spiritual is actually impregnating and entering in the material all the time. And you've got angels and demons running around, and it's not just like they're two dimensions that are touching, but they're actually interpenetrating in a much more interruptive way.
I think you see that in why Catholics still have exorcists much more so than Protestants do outside of the charismatic tradition. And why the charismatic tradition is growing like it is, I think, strangely enough, is the same reason the spiritual but not religious is. It's got a very prominent place for the spiritual immanent within the world. That's why they emphasize the role of the Holy Spirit very much within them and working out through miracles and charismatic gifts. That is a much more, I think, authentic way in which we encounter reality. And I'm not charismatic. I'm not Pentecostal. I'm not even tempted to become that. And yet I think they're scratching an itch that all Christians feel.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. You're not charismatic at all. Uh, no, but I think you're right. There's this history has these pendulum swings, and everyone's bringing God and creation too close, so we got to go the other direction. And then they're too far away from each other, so we swing back the other way because, hey, we want to feel God. I want God to be close to me. I don't
Yeah.
want to look up at the skies and not feel like no one's looking back. I don't want a deist God who creates me and then abandons me like an absent father. I want a close, personal God
Yeah.
who's intimate and cares about me. But then that gets a little overdone, and then we swing the other way again. And it's,
Yeah, absolutely. And today, it seems kind of weird to believe in fairies, but if somebody walked up to me, some Christian walked up to me and said they believe in fairies, I wouldn't be concerned because I recognize that whether or not they exist, the belief in fairies protects something I think very important, which is the mystery and the depth to the universe. That God, there's more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophies, to quote Shakespeare.
I dated a girl who believed in fairies, and I wasn't a Christian at the
Was it
time.
Madison?
No, it wasn't. And I think I made fun of her for believing in fairies, and then I go and become a Christian, and now I believe in a giant fairy. But
Yeah, good theology, John. I'm glad you got a PhD. A giant fairy.
Uh,
I nearly made a bad joke. Anyway, so on that though, that's honestly where I think that's something we can look at the spiritual but not religious and kind of adopt that. This is why I like some thinkers who are actually like Christian thinkers who are working in is telepathy real?
yeah.
We think of that and that's wooey and crazy, and yet our best episode, the one that we've done the best in, is the asking that question. So obviously Christians are interested. That episode and the Exorcist episode are the two most
Yeah,
the two
those
most
are
viewed
our
episodes.
best viewed episodes because people
We
are
want
excited
this.
about this. Yeah.
Yeah, we want
but-
an enchanted cosmos. Those two have nothing in common except the fact that they enchant the cosmos, re-enchant the cosmos.
And yet those are also the episodes that I think, the more skeptical minded would most dismiss as ridiculous, because we've assumed that being rational means shedding all of the spiritual interruptions of matter. Like maybe you can believe in a God who exists somewhere, but don't have him interrupting. Don't have him, entering in or, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Sometimes I think we're so concerned with trying to show that Christianity is true that it comes at the expense of the beauty and goodness of Christianity. That it really is an all-encompassing worldview that just changes everything the way you see. And sometimes we try to cut out the things that we think are super ridiculous, like demons and angels and maybe this other weird stuff, so much so that it ends up just looking like atheism plus God.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean, therefore, all those things are true. And as a Christian, I wouldn't embrace all of the spiritual but not religious. Yeah, I wouldn't embrace all of that. I definitely don't think we should be trying to summon the dead. I don't know if witchcraft is real or not, but I don't think we should be trying to do it. Sorry, Madison wants to be Hermione. My wife always, who doesn't want to be get their Harry Potter letter, but
I don't.
You don't. I'm sorry. Even
Make
as a
good
Christian,
kindling in my fire.
even as a Christian, if I get a letter to summon me to Hogwarts, I'm going, Seth. But
I think this reveals something about the state of your heart, Jonathan.
Yeah, but so yeah, I mean, I'm joking here, but we don't want to embrace all of these spiritual things, and yet we also don't want to just dismiss them en masse because we do believe in an enchanted cosmos where these things are possible.
Can I switch to a different topic though? One
You
I
wanna
think we
talk
need
about
to
Lord
cover.
of the Rings now instead?
Absolutely. I always want to
Okay.
talk about that, but maybe we should prioritize something that's in Lord of the Rings that Christians love, which is magic. Can Christians believe in magic? Remember that was one of the
Do
three
you
streams
believe in
that I said.
magic?
I mean,
Yeah.
if you remember, Eliphas Levi was thought he was trying to recapture an essential core to Catholicism that he thought had been forgotten, right? So this whole magical tradition, which out of it was spawned Wicca and these other views that like these modern witchcraft and stuff, actually began with a guy trying to redeem something about Christianity, which is weird. But did he have a point to it?
Well, I mean, how different is magic from prayer or, miraculous healings? What is the difference, Seth? I know that there's some theoretical distinctions that some scholars have tried to draw. I don't know how well they hold up. I mean, one of the distinctions is that magic is humans imposing themselves upon nature and controlling it in much in the same way that science imposes itself on nature and controls it, whereas religion is I ask God to do something and he does it or he doesn't do it depending on what he wants to do, but I'm not in control.
Well,
That's one distinction some people have tried to draw, but I don't know if that holds up.
That's not a good distinction because originally magic was never about me. That's a very modern idea that I throw up my wand and I have the magic. That's actually a modern view of magic. If you
Okay.
go back and look at what magic was like in the Middle Ages, you were summoning a being to do it for you. It was all about using these incantations and formulas to, in some sense, control or summon or request help from another being that did have the powers to do that. There wasn't a thought that necessarily that you had the power to do that. But then it switched, modern times to sort of a self-empowerment that I have the power to do this, right?
So is it precisely, it's not that magic led to science, not that alchemy led Newton to science, but it's actually the other way around, that the scientific view of dominating nature then has us read back and alter what we think of magic so that it's the same way, where it's human control over nature.
I would put it this way, because Milbank's written on this. The magical tradition and the scientific tradition kind of share a common core, which is control. This idea of control. It's just that the scientific tradition, which was linked to magic, it was sometimes called white magic. Francis Bacon talked about science as a form of magic a lot. He's the father of the scientific method. You read this in some of the early Enlightenment thinkers. They would talk about magic in conversation with science. This wasn't considered a distinction. And what's kind of funny is this kind of makes sense when some Japanese came over and saw Western science and what they were doing with electricity in the early 1900s. They went back and said, "Oh, so our magic is with blah 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 blah." They use the magic of electricity. They don't know how it works. It's some natural force, and they use it and harness it to make them do what they want. And they just call that magic. To them, what we called science, to them was just magic. It's using the natural forces and controlling them to create some good effect. To them, that's just what magic was.
But you're saying that in a medieval period, that's not the case. It wasn't control. It was summoning a being, asking them to take control of the situation.
Well,
so it's only in the modern period that both magic and science become about dominance over nature.
Well, there was a distinction in the Middle Ages between black magic and white magic, which we sometimes remember today. White magic was, you can use control over nature for good things. Are you using it for love and good deeds, right? That sort of magic was the church tended to allow. It'd be okay. And that's where you get some of these early scientists. Remember, magic and science were not distinguished back then. They were considered one and the same thing. And back in that day, yeah, you had white magicians who were messing with the elements to try and essentially figure out what things maybe like helped heal diseases. Black magic was, yeah, I'm going to summon a demon to get revenge on this dude. But the idea always was, what are you doing, and how is it, in some sense, trying to enact control on the world around you? That makes sense?
Yeah.
So, yeah, like magic, like if we talk about the magical tradition today, the biggest thing I think what we need to recognize is Christians in the Middle Ages, when they were doing magic, it looks a whole lot like science. They were never trying to control other beings, nor was there an assumption that there were these hidden latent powers within us that we should unlock in order to, in some sense, like
it was never our power. It was never our divine nature commanding the world.
No. In fact, quite often, you brought up prayer. Prayer is sometimes brought in conversation of what we traditionally think of as magic. And let me give you an example. Origen, one of the early church fathers, this is before the medieval period, very early on. There were, in the Roman world, exorcists. They had their own exorcists, and they would use these magical incantations and spells to drive out demons. And Origen came along and says, hey, do you want to know proof that our Christian religion is true? Look at our exorcists. It takes you all of this magic to cast out demons. We merely say the name of Jesus, invoke his power, or we say a prayer to God, and then the demons flee. We're so much more effective than you are at this. And what's essentially being done is Origen is saying our magic is prayer. Isn't that interesting? I think that's fascinating. He's not denying that other magic happens. What he is saying is the true magic, the true power, everything you were looking for in magical incantations is actually best found through the power of Christ and through the power of prayer.
So is there a validity to saying it's the difference between magic is my will being done versus prayer is saying, Lord, your will be done?
Well, I think it's a recognition of and an allowance of allowing God's power to flow through you versus a sort of grasping at power.
Yeah.
That makes sense? For one's own sake. I think that would be the only helpful distinction. I'm not even sure that's a helpful distinction.
No, not very helpful.
Yeah, I'm typically not super helpful at all. So anyway, what are your thoughts on that, John? Any final thoughts?
People already think I'm Hagrid. I just want to go. I just want to ride a hippogriff, Seth. Is that so wrong?
Yes. Yes, it deeply is wrong. Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe below, or to check us out on Spotify. And if you want to hear more from this week's episode or guest, our Patreon account has exclusive unaired content, often featuring up to an hour of additional footage and interviews for each episode. We save some of the most controversial and pulse-pounding topics just for our Patreon members. Members get access to that, plus a chance to meet monthly with Jonathan and I. suggest episode topics, join us live for an episode to ask the special guests questions, or even get a personalized episode custom made just for you. Check out our Patreon link in the description below. And don't forget to check out our official website at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com to see what else you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.